Good evening, everybody. My name is Representative Beth Moore. I'm a Peachtree Corners resident, like many of you. I want to also thank UPCCA for hosting this wonderful event. I want to recognize two special people in the crowd. First, my husband, Lori Moore, who's hiding in the back. My Chief of Staff, Matt Yarbrough, is also in the back. For those who have communicated with my office, chances are you may have communicated with Matt, as well as myself. So thanks to him and to my husband for supporting me in my first year as your State House representative. This was an exciting year down at the Capitol, for better or worse. I've heard a lot of feedback from folks who have been down there for a long time that this was kind of an unusual year. For a couple of reasons, due in part to the fact that we did have a new governor, a new lieutenant governor. We had 42 new state representatives. I'm sure Zara can tell us perhaps what the turnover was in the Senate. So we have a lot of new ideas, a lot of new energy, a lot of new people down at the legislature, and I'm very proud to be one of them, and I'm very honored that I can go down to the Capitol and represent all of you down there. I know we have a mixed crowd today, of folks who voted for me or didn't vote for me, and I respect however you voted. Just know that now that I'm in this role, this is no longer campaign mode, this is service mode, and I serve you as well, no matter how you voted. Some of the bills that stand out to me, and we can certainly talk about any of the topics that you all have interest in. I'm mostly looking forward to the Q&A portion of this evening, but I took a couple of notes on some of the bills that stood out. First, the only constitutional requirement that we have as legislators is to pass a budget. That's not always as easy as it sounds. There is a bipartisan group committee that gets together and works with the Office of Budget Management to put together what this year was about a $26 billion budget. And a budget is a reflection of our state's priorities. So we try to allocate money where it's most needed. I'm also very happy that we were finally able to put a down payment on that raise for teachers. We weren't able to get the full $5,000, but we can at least put down $3,000 for not only teachers, but also the support staff, right? And then for others that work in the education industry, for those who are not on the teacher pay track, they were able to get a 2% raise as well. Right? So this is good. On top of that, we're going to be able to fully fund the QBE formula, the Quality Basic Education formula. So Mary Kay is going to get her full budget instead of having to make cuts. So we're very happy about that. And of course, part of the reason why we're able to fully fund QBE and a lot of the state's priorities is because Georgia is on a firm financial footing. If you look at the graphs of our state revenues and how vibrant our tax base is and our business community here in Georgia, it's very healthy. Hopefully we can keep that upward trajectory and continue to fund programs like QBE and other priorities that we set as a state. Some of the bills that I want to highlight, Mayor Mason already pointed to one of the ones that I was most proud of, which is the 5G small cell bill. That was the product of months of negotiation. I can't take credit for that. That happened between the Georgia Municipal Association and the telecom companies in conjunction with the state legislators to make sure that we have a statewide framework to roll out the new 5G small cell technology. So all of our technology, our cell phones are going to work a whole lot faster. It's my understanding that means that once we have this new upgraded technology in place, that is going to help allow for upgrades to other technology like autonomous vehicles. Right now the technology to support those new programs will become possible once the 5G small cell technology gets rolled out. So that's a good thing for our cities, it's a good thing for consumers. I sit on the Banks and Banking Committee down at the legislature, so one of the exciting bills that we passed is a savings incentive program. We had to tweak the law a little bit to allow banks to offer incentives to encourage savings. I think many of us have heard the statistic that over half of American households cannot afford a $400 surprise bill. Right? That's pretty scary if you think about how, we all should be saving not only for rainy day, but for retirement. So we created a legal framework by which banks can incentivize folks to save by, you might call it a lottery system, but we had to differentiate the system from the actual Georgia lottery, to where if you participate in one of these savings programs, your name could be put in a drawing to receive, an extra $100 just for participating in the savings program, for example. So that was something that came through our committee. I was fully in support of that. That was a clear bipartisan win that we all signed on to. So you may see a program like that being rolled out by your local bank. One of the other ones that we worked on, which you guys may have heard of, was the low THC cannabis oil bill. This is the partner bill to another piece of legislation that was passed a couple of years ago, which would allow doctors to prescribe low THC cannabis oil to patients who need it, patients suffering from cancer and seizures and other ailments where cannabis oil has been proven to be very effective. The problem was that in Georgia it was legal to prescribe this medication, but there was nowhere for the patients to go to get it. So we had to put in place this companion bill to set up a legal framework for the production and distribution of low THC cannabis oil here in Georgia. That was the last bill that we voted on before we adjourned the legislature. It had large bipartisan support and support from the governor and the lieutenant governor, so we can fix that loophole in Georgia law so that patients can get the medication that they need. So I was very proud that we were able to get that bill done. And last is you guys may have heard of HB 316, which was the elections omnibus bill. There was some contention with that bill, which we can discuss tonight, but suffice it to say that at the end of the day, we in Georgia are going to get a paper trail in our electronic voting systems. And this is something that we talked a lot about. Yes. The bill that we passed, HB 316, was not a procurement bill. It was more setting up the legal framework. I use that term a lot. So that when the Secretary of State uses the allocated funding for a new election system, which right now we've allocated $150 million for that, that whatever system comes out of that purchase, that there'll be a legal framework, to regulate that. So, while that was a spirited discussion, I'm at least very happy that we'll finally be getting that paper trail for our voting system. That is the tip of the iceberg on some of the things that we worked on. I'm sure that you guys hopefully have brought questions or bills that you want to talk about, and we're happy to do that. And I'll mention this again at the end of the evening, but I want you to know that even though this is a part-time job, I do it full-time. So, just because the legislature is not in session doesn't mean that my service to you has ended. I have a legislative office at Atlanta Tech Park, right up the road from here. And every single one of you is welcome to make an appointment to come and meet with me at any time. If you go to my website, you'll see an option to schedule either a phone call with me or an in-person meeting with me up at Atlanta Tech Park. So you can find that scheduling option at moreforgeorgia.com. So thank you all for being here. So I know when we talk about medical marijuana that, the assumption is always that, we're moving toward a recreational marijuana policy. And the sponsors of this bill, who are all Republicans, by the way, went to great lengths to say that that's not the direction we're going in. This is about creating a prescription drug that physicians have legally prescribed to their patients in cases where this has been proven through medical science to be the best or one of the best ways to treat those illnesses. And there are a lot of people out there who need long-term pain management, and for them, one of the only other alternatives is to use opioids, right? And that's not a viable option for everybody. In fact, we've seen that has had disastrous impacts on some communities. So, let's set the recreational marijuana conversation aside, because that has nothing to do with the low THC oil program that that our state has taken the steps to implement. One of the things that the sponsor of this bill in the House stressed when we took our final vote on it is that one of the reasons why some states have moved quickly from medical marijuana to recreational is because in those states, they started out with the smoking version of marijuana as the medicinal form of it. That is not the case in Georgia, right? We are talking about low THC, which means that it does not have the hallucinogenic effects of regular marijuana. It is also low THC cannabis oil, which means that the only way it can be administered to patients is in oil form. The sponsors of the bill then went on to say, well, what about, it said that many people had concerns, well, what if that oil gets turned into edibles, right? You know, where you can ingest the oil. And the bill says in explicit language that that form of distribution is prohibited under this bill. You know, we're talking about a prescription medication that you will be able, if you are a patient and you are prescribed this pill, and by the way, there's a very limited list of ailments that this can be prescribed for, that you would be able to go to your regular pharmacy and be able to purchase that medication, you know, at the place where you purchase all of your other medication. Right, so we'll see how this develops. You know, like you said, there's only a couple thousand people in the state that have currently been prescribed this medication, but if it proves to be helpful to the patients who are suffering, who need it to manage their pain, their pain situation, or their seizures, or their cancer, I think this would be a good thing. And there may be people in this room right now who would benefit from that. And I want you to know that your state did the right thing. This had huge bipartisan support in both chambers, and I think it's the compassionate thing to do. So as you know, we did have the MARTA referendum on March 19th, and it did not pass. And, you know, we can talk about, you know, the issues involved with that, vote from, you know, dawn till dusk, but point is that it didn't pass, so we need to start over, right? We need to reevaluate how we address public transportation in Gwinnett County, because one thing I know for certain is that we cannot ignore it. You know, if any of y'all would like to come back next week on April 30th, I will be here doing another community event with Gwinnett County Commissioner Ben Koo, who represents this area. He's a big transit guy, but he's also in a position to take feedback from the community on, you know, what future initiatives on public transit may or may not look like. One of the things I found interesting about the transit referendum back in March is that if you take a heat map of the vote and lay that over the proposed plan, in other words, where the major corridors were, there is a direct correlation that those who resided along the proposed corridors were the ones that were most in favor of it. But that left out a large part of northern Gwinnett who were not able to see the proposed bus routes that would have gone through their area because there were so many that they didn't show up on many of the proposed maps that were being circulated for the transit referendum. There were also plenty of people who I spoke to who were not in favor of the full penny tax for as long as it was going to last. I mean, that is a reasonable objection to the plan, right? And one that we need to talk to our county commissioners about. The good news is, for those who are in favor of revisiting public transit, is that the story is not over yet. You know, this is something that we can come back, we can redesign, we can come back to the community. You know, we have in place from last session HB 930, which forms the Atlanta Area Transit Link. That is kind of an umbrella organization that is going to oversee some of the transit plans that are happening in the 13 metro Atlanta County area. So they're still interested in working with communities like Gwinnett on putting forward a transit plan that is not just centered around Gwinnett, but that connects Gwinnett to the 13 county area that I was talking about. Right, so that's another pathway for us to move forward is working with the ATL board as they become established. This MARTA vote that happened in March preceded the activities going on with the ATL board. Had the referendum passed, the ATL board would have overseen you know, those activities, just like they're going to oversee all of the Metro Atlanta transit activities. But there are still options on the table, and I really do encourage all of us here in Peachtree Corners, because we were going to be one of the biggest beneficiaries of that transit plan, and if you still want to, there's still an opportunity for us to talk about that with our county commissioners, with our community leaders. As someone at the legislature, the best I can do at this point is make sure that we have, you know, additional funding available for it, but there's, to the extent that there's anything that we can do legislatively, to make sure that we keep this conversation going. You can count me in as a partner on that. I can tell you from, we did pass a referendum, I forget which referendum it was, I'll probably have it in my notes, but there was one that we passed to protect the coastlines. You know, there's been a lot of discussion at the national level about offshore drilling. You know, that has come up as a possibility with some states being particularly exempted. Georgia was not one of them. So what we decided to do as both the House and the Senate is, you know, with the support of leadership, is we passed a House resolution that was, again, passed by both chambers to urge our state and national leaders to not conduct offshore drilling or seismic testing off the coast of Georgia. This was a bipartisan House resolution put forward by the representatives who live along Georgia's coastline. And their main concern is protecting Georgia's tourism and fishing industries. You know, and I would say that that has a direct correlation as well to climate change, is making sure that, you know, we protect our coastlines, protect our oceans, protect our fisheries and our tourism. So this was definitely a point that came up in the, you know, in the discussion about HB 316, the Elections Omnibus Bill. So when it was proposed that we include language in the legislation to prohibit the use of barcodes, the response from the majority party was that if we did that, it would effectively reduce the number of eligible vendors to one. There's only one current vendor of election machines that would be able to offer a system that did not involve barcodes. You know, I can't speak for Senator Karen Shack, but I can tell you in the House, you know, the vote on 316 was essentially along party lines. You know, you know, for me, it was a difficult vote because on the one hand, I very much want, you know, a paper trail with our election system. That's, you know, what we've all, Republican, Democrat, Independent, we've all been saying has been missing from our voting system for, you know, the past decade or more. I'm happy that we're now going to get it. You know, the election system that we have now is wholly inadequate. So really, it's hard to get worse than what we have now. For me, the deciding factor of why I ultimately did vote against the machines, in addition to concerns about barcodes, is really what the election security experts were saying about, you know, the breadth of choices that we have on voting machines. You know, they said if you want the safest, most reliable, most hackable free system, you move to hand-marked paper ballots. But there is a good counterpoint to that, that even with hand-marked paper ballots, which is the best way to capture the intention of the voter, that would still require an electronic system that would count those votes based on coordinates, right? So to a certain extent, you cannot get away from the electronic piece of this puzzle. But what we were assured the Secretary of State's office would do is that the end result of whatever system they ultimately procure, that you will be able to hand read the ballot for a human auditable system should one be deployed. And I would recommend that we do spot testing, you know, all across the state. We don't necessarily have to audit every single county, but we should be auditing for efficacy to make sure that there are no problems with the system overall. You know, there are lots of improvements I would have liked to see with that bill, but I'm also not a sky is falling type of person when it comes to it. After all, you good people did you know, elect both me and Zara, so, you know, the system must work to a certain extent. You know, I'm not going to say that, you know, that the system is completely broken. It can be improved. And this is inevitably the system that we're going to end up with. So, you know, some of my friends on the other side of the aisle, they assured me that they had some of the same concerns, and that they would make sure that whatever system we procured would not have some of those inherent problems in it. But I'm satisfied that we will have a human readable, auditable system. So. You guys may be aware that the state legislature did implement a bill last session that reduced the personal income tax rate. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you've done your homework. It went from 7 to 6.5. or 6 to 5 and a half?
6 to 5 and a half.
6 to 5 and a half, thank you, yes.
Might say it's not enough, but that's a difference.
Yeah, and part of that bill preempted the future votes and said that, you know, if the legislature should so choose, they could further reduce the state income tax rate by 0.25% in future legislative sessions. So that did not come up this session. It may come up next session. You know, if you look at the overall state budget, you'll see that about 50% of our state's operations are paid for through state income tax. So that is an important part of what keeps our schools funded, keeps our roads paved, keeps our departments up and running that provide critical life-saving services to people. So that's how our state revenue structure is set up. You know, is that, you know, we pitch in on a progressive, or in this case, a flat tax rate. Now, there are two considerations that I will think about if or when the next phase of that bill comes up, which is to consider reducing by another 0.25%. Number one, what are our state revenues currently? You know, is it enough to fund our state obligations, right? Because we do have federal obligations that we have to meet, or else we are failing as a state. So we have to make sure that we have enough resources to, you know, fund those operations that we are legally required to provide, such as education, and a myriad of other things. So, you know, right now the good news is that our state is doing so well that revenues are going up. We have enough money to fully pay for education. We do have enough money to meet the funding criteria that each of our department heads put forth. There's also a lot of things that we're not currently doing that any of us could argue that we should be doing. But the reason why we're not doing them is because people say, well, we don't have the money to do it. So that's where the budget comes in. That's where the budget becomes a reflection of our priorities. As long as our priorities are being met and we have more than enough money to do it, then there may be some wiggle room to give you guys a refund for the excess that our state takes in that, you know, is beyond the scope of our priorities. You know, but at the same time, you know, economies can change. You know, I don't think anybody, well, kudos to you if you're in this room and you predicted what happened back in 2008 with the crash of the economy. We also have to be prepared for those times, you know, where we may need to take in revenues to cover those priorities. So that it's you know, it's a balance. You got to figure out where that right balance is, because once you lower state income taxes, it is really hard to get them back up. You know, if we need that to cover our priorities. So we just kind of got to wait and see what's happening. You know, I'm a taxpayer too. I don't think anybody wants to have to pay more than they have to. But the key is that we need to make sure that we're funding the obligations that we need to our children, to our citizens, to our communities, to the public at large, to each and every one of you guys.